This is the KhoodeelaarTV campaign broadcasting online from London, UK, in the morning of Friday, the 14th of August 2020. We are doing this series of technically test broadcasts, which means that we are testing our own facilities and familiarities with the technical installation that is involved in the broadcasting, which means that we are not yet broadcasting on a regularly scheduled set of programs, and we are doing this to get the technical facilities just about working so that we can do the schedules with reliability and predictability in order to reach the various people that might be interested in viewing and interacting intelligently, responsibly with us. This is the KhoodeelaarTV campaign, which is based on the Siloti language word Khoodeelaar. Khoodeelaar is, in the European linguistic context, it is the nearest expression that can be used in the UK is the French one, oh yeah, O-Y-E-Z is how it is spelled. So, oh yeah is a town crier's cry. But the KhoodeelaarTV campaign is more than a cry of one town crier on one issue. It's a multi-dimensional word based in the Siloti language, which is the main language spoken by the overwhelming majority of Bangladeshis in London, in the UK, and very large number of Siloti speakers are living in various European, North American countries, and some in the Latin American countries, as well as in the Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, and in parts of North Africa, and small numbers in African countries and Latin American countries. So the Siloti language word Khoodeelaar was devised by me, and it was initially in order to alert the community in the Brick Lane, London E1 area that was the target of a big hole. The hole is like a mile high. I mean, that is the measure of the hole. It was not a tiny hole of few feet. It was a mega hole plotted to be dug in the middle of Brick Lane as part of the alignment of the cross London railway connection that was being built. And the idea was to use that hole to get out of the tunnel that they were building underneath the ground, all the dirt and the rubbish. Now, considering that all this dirt and the rubbish would take about 10 years, the construction would take about 10 years, the bringing out of the dirt and the rubbish and the dust and all the other garbage, and literally other garbage, would have destroyed Brick Lane, the adjoining area. This is economically still a very important part of the local economy on which the Bangladeshis depend very essentially. And Brick Lane socially has become, in the last 50 years, the front line of the defense against the various attacks aimed at the community known as the Bangladeshis. But of course, the whole would have affected other people, not necessarily Bangladeshis, but resident in the same area, affected by the same environmental activities and impact. So the word Khoodeelaar was first of all to alert the Siloti, mainly Siloti speaking people, to the danger of dislocation, losing the homes and their small businesses and the streets, because the streets would become unusable for 10 years, 8 years, 7 years, whatever the length of time we anticipated it would take. We anticipated in the year 2003, in December 2003, when the alert against the Crossrail hole and in defense of the community in the east end of London, focusing on Brick Lane's defense first, began. And I worked with Kay Jordan, who was already running a set of her own defenses for the community by supporting small businesses and supporting small business tenancies, despite lots and lots and lots of difficulties and obstructions. And this was the last thing we needed. This was the last thing Kay Jordan needed for the community to be faced with. So Kay Jordan and I agreed to mount an immediate program that has not been seen in London, in any part of England in the last 100 years. A political campaign that is aimed at the very heart of, quote, democratic power and authority, the Westminster Parliament-based government. This is something that we can see the comparison with. For example, the HS2, which you oppose as well in principle, but HS2 is much bigger in scale and in terms of the money involved, but Crossrail is also a multi-billion pound project. But the HS2, which is a later program, is about 5 times as costly or as extensive because it covers areas from London to the Midlands. But the comparison is in terms of the logistics, how the Khoodeelaar campaign could actually mount a campaign against the government, against Parliament, and against the local council. Compare that with the dozens of local councils across the route of the planned HS2 that are opposed to HS2. They are opposed to HS2, whereas in Tower Hamlets, Brick Lane is in the London Borough of Tower Hamlets. So the Tower Hamlets Council was colluding with the attack. Colluding with the attack on Brick Lane and on the rest of the community, rest of the east end of London via that attack on Brick Lane. So the Tower Hamlets Council, the elected council, was colluding with the attack, and the local MPs. The local MPs were divided. One was supporting our campaign, and the reason is purely for their own survival, because it was the supporter candidate or the MP, sitting MP, was George Galloway. And Galloway needed to be seen to be supporting our campaign because otherwise he was seen as a liability in the constituency. And the liability factor became absolutely pronounced in January 2006 when he became a guest of the notorious Channel 4 Big Brother House, where he took part in an activity where he was featured as a cat and doing all sorts of embarrassing things in front of camera and in association with his co-appearee, Rula Lenska. So, having been discredited in the constituency and across the country generally based on his embarrassing appearance there, George Galloway was under severe pressure from Tony Blair. Tony Blair was the prime minister at the time, and Blair is the one who kicked him out of the Labour Party a few years earlier, which is how George Galloway became forced to seek a detour in Tower Hamlets, and his detour trick was to impersonate, not as a cat, but impersonate as a friend of the community. And he pretended to be a friend of the Muslims. And that story in detail is for another time, for updates. Of course, we have discussed this before, but it's update. So the Khoodeelaar campaign was to alert the community against immediate danger. And K. Jordan and I devised the program. As I said, unprecedented, because we devised the program to unseat the local council leadership. We devised the program aimed at unseating them. And it was quite obvious in January 2006 that we were succeeding, to the point where they became absolutely the target of total contempt by the mainly Bangladeshi community linked people and observers and people who were hearing, as it became obvious at a rally which they had conspired to hold at the Brady Center against the Khoodeelaar campaign tactics and strategy. But that rally turned out to be the Khoodeelaar campaign rally. The details will be updated in due course, but essentially, I was the main speaker, not because they wanted me to be the main speaker, but the evidence became so clear that when I spoke, that speech was treated as the speech by the audience, and they supported me unanimously. There was no opposition, even if there were councillors, local councillors, including Michael Crook, otherwise known as Professor Michael Keith, currently lodged in a consignment in the Oxford University. We shall come to update on Michael Crook and how racistly he behaved when he found that his role as a leader of the council was being exposed and brought to severe scrutiny by our campaign. So he resorted to very corrupt and mean-minded tactics in order to discredit the campaign against Crossrail Hole, which was also at the same time the campaign against the council role in inviting the Crossrail Hole. That was the slogan, that was the message that got through to the community. So this is the Khoodeelaar campaign, and it is constitutional campaign, lawful campaign, ethical campaign, moral campaign, unprecedented in the history of local communities' action in the last 200 years, I would say, not 100 years, in that context. People have done violent confrontations, of course, but we did not have a single violent confrontation at all in the 8 years that we actually did the campaign, 6 years in the core years, but the main campaign was done constitutionally, lawfully, legally. And essentially, doing my tasks on the job as the source of all kinds of representations and analysis and research and the rest of it. I was supported mainly by K. Jordan, and K. Jordan herself was under pressure from various touts working for the interests of the Tower Hamlets Council and other interests to distance herself from the Khoodeelaar campaign. They did not succeed, but we had to do daily work round the clock in order to stay active and ongoing. So this was the work done, amounted to the work of an entire department of a government or more. So when I compare this with this HS2 and the campaign against the HS2, which is ongoing, I do that consciously aware about the volume of work needed, the quality of work needed, and the magnitude of the pressure that the work has to be done under for years, not for 1 week, not for 1 month, not for 1 year, but for years. And there is evidence that the supporters of the campaign against the HS2, various supporters, including many leading councillors in many of the councils on the way, and highly paid employees in those councils have actually dedicated, allocated, made available total amounts in the millions to fight the Crossrail like, but many times bigger in terms of the size, attack on their relevant communities. So the unprecedented thing is that unlike Tower Hamlets Council, those councils are actually opposing HS2. Tower Hamlets Council was inviting the Crossrail Hole project. So we had to fight the council, and we had to fight the government, and we had to fight the big contractors pushing it, and we had to fight the big lawyers or big paid lawyers or highly paid, overpaid lawyers and licensed law traders, every stage and every point on the way to the confrontation, which was reaching a climax until about 2006 and 2007. They realized that there was no way that we would give up. The campaign would not give up because it was getting momentum from the support, awareness that we raised in the community and among the wider public. And we gave the arguments, original arguments, based on scientific work and diagnosis of the scientific, pretend scientific claims they were making in support of the whole. So we demolished their arguments and their presentations and their highly paid logistics and installations of lawyers and propagandists and their people in the mainstream, the BBC, the Guardian, the Evening Standard, so-called. And that is one of the reasons why I call the Evening No Standards Standard, because it doesn't tell the truth, and it wasn't telling the truth about the impact of the Crossrail Hole on the community. In fact, it treated our campaign and the community in Brick Lane and from Brick Lane as if we did not exist. There is hardly any reference in any of the coverage of the Evening No Standard Standards over the 6 or 7 years. Same case with the Guardian. Same case with the BBC, except one single solitary exception in March 2006, which was actually in the then politics show, where there was a segment contributed in the name of the BBC London part. And the segment itself contained a number of misleading words and whatever, but the fact is that it did appear, and it featured myself and K. Jordan as among the contributors. And it, irrespective of whatever the contents were, it actually alerted the council and the then London mayor, Ken Livingstone. He was still lying, and his colluders and this Crossrail company and the Department for Transport, or Department at the expense of transport, they were all alerted to the fact that the campaign was going to be continuing against the Crossrail Hole being dug in Brick Lane and attacking the east end of London. So instead of engaging with us in exchanging points of arguments and evidence, they simply announced that this whole and this route, this alignment would not happen. That way, they got away with not having to explain their errors and their lying for the previous years. In all of these, George Galloway was not playing the part of a radical, leading, campaigning MP. He was following us and he was reflecting on the platforms that we had created, including being invited, because he was the MP, sitting MP of the constituency. He was invited to appear on that edition of the politics show on the BBC on the 26th of March 2006. And he had no option but to support the opposition to the Crossrail hole. So George Galloway was in a position he could not say yes to the hole. And Jim Fitzpatrick was in his DNA, political DNA, his career. He is a colluder and he is a wrongdoer. So he colluded and he did wrong, and he never supported us. In fact, he spoke against our campaign and in support of Crossrail whole plot in June 2007 during a demonstration we organized against Alan Johnson, who was a minister and who was visiting a number of stooges or visiting some supporters in a restaurant in Osborne Street, which is next to Brick Lane. And we held an active, very vocal demonstration outside. And opposite us was Jim Fitzpatrick speaking to the so-called media in support of the Crossrail whole project. So the unprecedented nature of our achievement in stopping the Crossrail hole included all of these activities, and on a daily basis we had to write, research, write and publish original opposition to the Crossrail hole and arguments in defense of the community, and including everything: economics, the social condition, the lack of democracy, accountability, and all the other things. Combined, all of these factors ended up being the unprecedented kind of pressure felt by the, quote, leadership of the entire Hrs Council. We shall come to that for a detailed update, and we shall be doing that shortly after this one. These charities, as we said, the charities are not accountable, and particularly the Charity Commission does not hold charities to account. And the regime that is currently in place at the Charity Commission, it has removed whatever pretense there was of holding the big charities or the charities to account. And it is equivalent to the removal of regulations by Robert Jendrick from the planning process for degenerators to make profit-making buildings and structures in areas where the local communities would not receive any real and needed benefit. So the charities are still resisting calls for openness on executive pay. This is the last of the problems the charities represent: big pay for the executives. Because the charitable purpose that they aim to carry on and pursue those need to be made open. To what extent are they pursuing those purposes? And as I said, in the case of the RSPCA, the charity supposedly in existence for preventing cruelty to animals, is itself the perpetrator of the largest number of massacres and murders of animals. And the RSPCA is the big one, but there are other so-called animal welfare charities that are committing crimes against animals every day, and there is no accountability by them, and there is no space in the mainstream media for the demand for them to be held to account for their behavior in perpetrating cruelty to the animals they're supposed to protect. RSPCA is on the record as having lied in a series of communications during July-August 2012. And that series of lies is traceable to a racist woman employed in the name of the Spitalfield Small Business Association, where K. Jordan had been the director. That woman was employed in that post at the time, 2012, because K. Jordan was no longer in place. So this woman perpetrated a series of criminal communications to the RSPCA, to the Tower Hamlets Council, and to a number of other organizations, including the police, making a number of criminally intended falsified statements. We shall come to her and her criminality and how Lutfur Rahman actually allowed her to continue the criminality, and his touts and propagandists, apologists allowed her to commit the series of crimes. And in that series of crimes would be included another charity, one of the biggest advertisers of the patriotic, caring British, the Booth House and the Salvation Army. They were lied to about what was going on in the center of the protection or the need for protecting a number of animals that had been threatened by that woman. So there is a long list of people involved in committing crimes in Brick Lane. And that is part of the original exclusive evidence that I tried to get published lawfully, constitutionally, and I tried to get redressed by the court, High Court, and what happened in the High Court and how the overdue remedies have not been delivered or available will be the subject of a number of reports from this channel. And those reports would include and have impact on the behavior of Roxana Fias and her colluders and stooges. And so what this channel is doing is unique because no channel, whatever the status, whether they are quote mainstream BBC, ITV, or in the international context from another country, or being run by any kind of funded, approved non-profit operation, whatever the basis, nobody is reporting on these wrongdoings and these criminalities. And this channel is about campaigning against those wrongs and to extrapolate the campaigning impact across the world and across the society so that similar wrongs are detected and notified and noticed and stopped. And the wrongs, the targets of the wrongdoings, the victims of the wrongs are prevented from being harmed and done wrong to in time. And in the case of the Times article about the big charities still resisting calls for openness on executive pay, this is symbolic piece. It's not really a genuinely dedicated piece of journalism against the abuse of charities, big bosses, whatever. And this is symptomatic of the weakness of the Times newspaper that has been weak for decades, even before Murdoch took it over. And so therefore what it does, we're doing the review of the press, diagnosing. It's not the review. Diagnosing means that we are actually going into the depth of the contents and their agenda and the reasons. The Times newspaper has got a world famous, in the history of English language newspapers, world famous page called the letters page. And letter to the Times is unparalleled in terms of the kind of quote unique fame it has gathered for itself. I have been a writer of letters to the Times, but not as often as I would have done if they were not so racist and so ignorant. But I have had a few letters published. Compared to the number of letters that would have been published if I had written them, those few are very insignificant, because the issues that I campaign on and the issues that warrant publication are far higher in number than the issues that I covered in those very limited number of letters. And the reason I don't send letters is because the Times is a racist newspaper meant for Europeans. And this is not my word. A look at the last 200 years of the Times letters will show that it is a European people's column, the letters column, as is the rest of the paper. Anyone who appears writing either a letter or an article or a byline who is not an actual European white person does so as an exception, as an extremely remarkable, significant exception. That is not what the Times is. The Times is a racist paper maintaining, perpetuating, and perpetrating a daily racist status quo. And that is why the executive, big pay executive, is still an issue. If the Times carried and covered the truth and the accounts given by me, for example, of what is going on at various levels and in various organizations, it would have been party to solving a lot of these problems. And extrapolate that, multiply that by the other newspapers, including by The Guardian, and it is possible to see that most of the social ills afflicting this society long before the pandemic would have been solved, and there would be no need for protests like what they called in Brixton in South London last week, by mainly African descended people marching, wearing a kind of uniform. And there would be no murders of innocent black people by the police in America or in Britain. And there would be no need for Black Lives Matter. So the press, I'm diagnosing the Fleet Street papers, and that is the diagnosis. That is the kind of thing that a diagnosis entails. It is not something that the reviewers of the press on the BBC mainstream news channel or their counterparts on Sky News or on ITV's Good Morning Britain slot or on the Channel 4 News, they would not do this diagnosing, never. And I come to Paul Foot, and I come to the slot that Channel 4 had about the papers before it was scrapped. Paul Foot was one of the presenters of What the Papers Say, a slot that was in place for a long time and was presented by, memorably by me at least, by a man called Brian Inglis, Inglis. Brian Inglis was the one that actually was more often seen and remembered. And then Paul Foot I remember because he was probably the only one of the presenters, there were several, who came from a different angle or came with a different angle that was not subservient to the interests of the proprietors in Fleet Street or in the mainstream media. And Paul Foot did that because he was ideologically, quote, a socialist and as a member of the what is now the Socialist Workers' Party. Paul Foot, despite all of these, quote, positive things that I have said about him, presenting the What the Papers Say, failed. Paul Foot failed to oppose the depth of the corruption that actually exists and had existed in the Fleet Street papers. And it goes without saying that Paul Foot was not drawing attention to the perpetuation and the perpetual racism in the media, let alone in the government. What he did about those amounted to exceptional tokenistic bits. And as I have said in another program, Paul Foot was a racist personally. He knew me from the campaign in support of Mark Hosenball and Philip A.G., but he refused to acknowledge having even seen me. So that is how Paul Foot was a racist. And he had known me from contacts with me he made when he was editor of the Socialist Worker. And he even quoted me, although he misspelled my name, but he quoted me as the then particular leader of that particular campaign against racism. That was in 1976. So years later, when I bumped into him in Fleet Street, he failed to recognize or remember me. That is how brazen these left-wing socialists in Britain are. If that is the case, then there is no hope of Britain ever being politically anything other than racist, which takes us bang back into the discussion of this week and the plight of the migrants trying to cross from Calais in France to the UK. All the discussions we have made about the migrants' plight has been mainly about the council, the politicians, and peripherally about the charities. But this issue of the migrants being denied rights that are enshrined in the 1951 Refugee Agreement and Convention and other treaty agreed to and signed up to by the UK should have been raised by several charities in this country, and they haven't. Not in any way or shape or form that can be mentioned or can be justifiably said to be enough. And I'm making this point, and I have been making this point, because they have not been making the point. And the reason why they have not been making the point is because the existing funded states of subservience to the state and to their funders and to their other approvers and sponsors. So the charities are committing crimes, direct and indirect. So they have to be prosecuted. And there is no body, there is no campaign, and there is no movement among the mainstream politicians or political factions or outfits to bring them to justice. Now, even if there were actions initiated in the courts of law, there would be no remedy that would favor the campaigners, because the courts of law and the legal bureaucracy and the licensed law traders are themselves constituted and licensed and given platforms on the basis of maintaining the status quo and denying anyone who really wants to change the real practices of these institutions, to deliver the truth, to equality and fairness and towards justice. And we shall be talking about the legal illegality or legalized criminality inbuilt in Britain in due course in an extended edition. This is something that doesn't have enough time in one particular broadcast to go into an examination of the corrupt and the criminal and the racist legal system. And as I have said before, the fact that Charles Dickens wrote a number of novels and stories and accounts about the so-called legal system does not mean that he knew what he was talking about, let alone that he wanted to tell the truth. So we shall come to that as well. And the Pickwick Papers, which refer, Charles Dickens's Pickwick Papers, which refer to Whitechapel in Tower Hamlets, is very important, because when he referred to this, there was no Booth House based in Whitechapel Road. There was no other landmark kind of situated there at the time that is now there. And the fact that the Booth House, which is the Salvation Army's name for its kind of structure where it is based, but the Booth House has been made defunct in the last 2 years or so. But for many years until then, it was the center of the operations of Salvation Army in Tower Hamlets. The Salvation Army is now actively participating in the corrupt operation of the Department for Work and Pensions and the Tower Hamlets councils or local councils housing crisis creation project, homelessness crisis creation project. And the details of that will never be published by the Times, nor would be echoed by Ruth Lister, who is supposed to be the anti-poverty campaigner who is now lodged in the House of Lords. Nor would John, the man who founded the big issue, he would not be bothered about any of these facts, because he is now a member of the House of Peers. So what I'm outlining here, what I'm explaining here in this diagnosis of Fleet Street is that state of sickness at every stage in society in Britain, and especially I'm focusing attention on the so-called democratic side, the campaigning aspects and entities that are really not campaigning for what they say they're campaigning for. So the society needs a very serious, not reform, absolute replacement, morally, ethically, politically, democratically. And all of these apply to Tower Hamlets Council. And they apply every single day with every single evidence of the misconduct and misbehavior by the Tower Hamlets Council as misled and misrepresented by the current incumbent in the corrupting post of elected mayor. And what is happening in Tower Hamlets is happening in Newham, and it is happening in more worrying ways to perpetuate poverty and hunger in this country than any of the reports in the papers would ever suggest is the case. So the migrants who are risking their lives to cross from Calais to Dover need information. And I go back 28 years to January 1992 when I said on Channel 4 news slot that the way to deal with the poverty and the hunger of people who are trying to come to the West from Africa and Asia is to deal with the poverty and hunger and end the cycles of poverty, hunger, and injustice in those countries. None of the Western countries has taken up that advice, and it is more relevant every passing day, and it has been relevant every day for 28 years plus. Because I made that broadcast about the beginning of the year 1992, January 1992, I think. And so therefore, it is now nearly 29 years. And all the governments in Britain that have taken power since that time have ignored what I said, and they're still ignoring what I said. And I'm saying that this is the best way forward to stop the stampede of racists to the Dover and the coastline to defend this country from 10 or 12 very frightened migrants seeking refuge in this country. So we shall be stopping at that stage, which is 7 minutes past 10 GMT in the morning of Friday, the 14th of August 2020. We shall continue in the next edition or the next recording of this series, and we shall look at the Guardian and the Daily Mail of Friday, the 14th of August 2020.